Hey, so everyone, so welcome to this live Q&A session with Prince David on prevention. So Prince, that's really wonderful presentation that you just made. So we have a number of questions that came in from the audience, and we would have about 20 minutes in this live Q&A session. So I think I would just go ahead with the first question, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I'm ready.
Okay, good. The first question was asked by Angela Deborah. She asked that, I would like to hear about best practices when doing prevention work in a community where the perpetrators are from the same community and often they're close relative. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for this opportunity really to respond to the questions, and thank you for putting the questions up over there. I've tried to respond to Angela in the replies, but let me mention that most of the perpetrators, particularly the recruiters, are from the community, and recruitment of victims, if I may use the word, children or adults, is usually in the context of trust. So it's a very common thing, because no trafficker comes in saying that I'm here to recruit people. They're not usually from outside. So that's a very common thing in the context of trust. Of course, the challenge that Angela has presented in the case scenario in her reply to the first response that I made to her was that these are people who are pimps. And so begin with the premise that nobody in the first instance wanted to become a pimp, right? There's always that innate goodness in people. And because of lack of opportunity, a lot of people enter into cities and they take on businesses which then, of course, are a source of income, and it just becomes a way of life. Now, having said that, that doesn't resolve the problem, or that doesn't solve the problem. The best example of actually preventing is to bring in survivors and asking them to share their stories in the community. Some of the horrors that they have gone through. Awareness is something that best happens when people tell their stories of shock. It's both therapeutic for the person who's telling their story, the survivor, and also for the community to realize what's happening. And that then enables the community to identify potential and current perpetrators. Obviously, there is a specific context to what Angela has asked, but I hope that sort of gives you a sense of what could begin to happen if people are encouraged to tell their stories.
Yes, that's excellent. I think that's kind of to build the immunities in the communities. That's right.
Yeah.
So the next question, which came in, I think that many organizations that work on prevention has this kind of questions. The question was asked by Lucy McCrae, that she would love to hear about prevention models that go beyond pure awareness raising.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because sometimes prevention assumes that awareness raising is part of it. Now, awareness raising is very integral. So it's probably pretty much the core of the first things first. And then there are reasons. And as I was presenting, I said quite in the beginning, to understand the factors why trafficking really happens. It's because of illiteracy. It's because of low socio-economic strata of people, abuse, and disadvantaged communities. And then, of course, other factors like disability, poor self-governance. So one has to have a comprehensive approach, because just awareness raising will not save or stop trafficking. For instance, when we were working in communities where children, pretty much from one village where we first encountered this problem, where 1 to 3 children from every family was trafficked over the last 5 to 7 years. It was a shocking story. But if we were just to say, okay, here's a story of a child who was trafficked, this is what happens, don't send your children away. That was not going to happen, because people were only too happy let their children go because they could not feed them. So what do we do? Livelihoods is one important issue to address. And building resilience, that's why I keep using the word resilience. If we have resilient communities, it's a holistic approach. It's an approach that enables communities to flourish. And if we understand the reasons, then we integrate our response according to the reasons or the gaps that we find in the community. I hope this sort of helps to see what are some of the reasons and what can be done in a case. And I hope that could be a starting point, but I'm quite happy later on to pick this question and go deeper if there are any particular nuances that need to be addressed.
Yes, so I think that's fantastic. I mean, the way you mentioned that the prevention should be comprehensive and just go beyond awareness raising. I mean, what happened after they know, and then what you mentioned about livelihood, because after they know, but they still need to sustain their life, and then how that can happen so that it can help with the prevention. Very good. Maybe I just move on to another question, which came in from Andy. Andy asks, how can we scale up the impact of our prevention programs? So scaling up.
Yeah. So I think the starting point always is a fewer number of communities where we work in, because that's the kind of reach that the voluntary sector has. In my presentation, I said quite in the beginning, probably it was point number 2 on the first slide, which says that once communities recognize that their problem is not just poverty, their problem is lack of understanding as to what happens to those who are trafficked, they take on responsibility. Of course, it means community mobilization, working with communities in understanding what trafficking is from source where they are to what happens to people in once they are taken away. That is a beginning of a movement, if I may call that, or that's the beginning of a revolution. And that's the one thing that we can, in our work with communities, can do that. Now, what happens is, initially we were working in 10 communities in the northern part of India, just 10 communities, which still amounts to the population size of a few 100,000.
Wow.
And we found that each time we went, there was a good news that was being spread by people who had now learned to save their children from traffickers. So if there was a father and mother, and they had a daughter who was married in the next village, and even if that village was not our target area, these parents would go and tell people in that village, because of the relationship in that village, that you have good news because we have good news, we're wanting to share this with you. And so it becomes viral. It really is viral in the community. So viral is not just in social media, on screen, but there's viral in the community, and that really takes on. Of course, how do we scale up? I think the scaling up is best done if we work in tandem with the government, if we work in tandem with others who become our allies, and not just see ourselves as an anti-trafficking organization with our flag and we are the ones going forward. There are so many people who have the same interest. They may just be addressing the issue of floods. They may be addressing the issue of education. But if we bring them together, we will find there's a huge number of allies, and the program can scale up pretty, way beyond our resources and our ability if we just work with the government and with other allies in the area. And of course, the community is the best way to make things viral.
Yes. I think we still have time maybe for one or two more questions. And I think what I would like to go about it is that, I mean, there's this question, I think, built on what you already said or presented from Sophia Johnson. Can you share a bit more on how you work with local authorities on prevention?
Okay. I think the very key point, because local authorities really have the responsibility because they are the government in that state or in that district. Some of our experience is that there are good people in local authorities in positions of leadership, but they are not as aware of the problem because they may not necessarily belong to that place. They are people who have been posted from the cities in a rural scenario. They are just doing a job. And quite often it's best to go and talk with them about the nature of problems, bring them into the community, rather having a confrontational approach by saying, you're not doing this, you must do this. Advocacy is great, but if you can have a confluence rather than a conflict in advocacy and bring the community, the other C to it, then it actually becomes very useful. So I would say, begin with the development office. Usually in my country, and I'm sure it's pretty similar to other countries, we have block development officials. Work with them. When there are things happening in the community, invite them over so that they get a feel of sense and connectedness. That's one. The second one is actually working with the law enforcement authorities, because they are actually very important in this whole business. Because if we have good law enforcement, we can actually achieve much of our objectives in bringing trafficking to zero. I've seen actually trafficking come to zero in communities within 6 to 18 months. And that was possible because the law enforcement authorities were also brought into the picture. And in some cases, they were very honest, and education was given to them on what happens. And they were able to use their entire force because they felt connected to the grassroots. Those are just two simple examples. Begin with where people are and work with them in bringing a confluence of ideas and bringing a confluence of objectives, especially with the government, and our targets can be achieved much faster.
Yes, excellent. I think that's very important counterpart that we need to work with the local authorities. I see in the chat rooms that to build on that, there's also questions about faith-based groups, spiritualities and activities on how those can help with the prevention. Would you like to say something about that?
Yeah. So faith-based communities, I think we know that all across Asia, people are religious. It's almost like an accepted fact. And there is a huge amount of respect for faith. And so the last, in the presentation, I talked to you about faith-based communities. Much of that is through groups, because the best penetration is of faith-based groups because they exist, they are organic, they are right there in the heart, they know the pulse and the beat, they know who's going where. And so to begin with, and identify one faith-based group to begin with, or maybe two, depending on what is the majority groups there, and invite their leaders. Usually the best way to do is not to start talking about trafficking because they're so close to the community. There can be threats, there can be fears. The important thing is to start talking about protection. There is no faith that does not believe in the protection and the goodwill of humanity. Be it the church, be it the temples, be it any faith. And so to begin with a common idea of protection of humanity, in fact, it can even grow into peace and a reconciliation if there are those issues in the community and harmony. But to begin with, protection. And I think protection, everybody wants to protect their children because that's the first thing that they do as parents. It speaks to the hearts of faith leaders, and they will find scriptures to back that up. And then every faith-based community has a structure. We don't even have to go and form one. And there is such a magnificent impact when we begin at, like in the case that I shared in the presentation. It was a case of working in Nepal, a regional level discussion or consultation resulting in doing something at a sub-regional level and then going down even further to the district. And it just cascaded one after another. I would highly, highly recommend working with faith-based groups, because that can really scale up and you leave a very sustainable impact. As NGOs, we will just work there for 2, 3, 4, 6 years, 10 years, depending on what. But then you actually help change their thinking, their ideology, their theology connects with something which is very close to their heart and close to the heart of God, if I may say that.
Yes, thank you. I think we have time for the last question, which is asked related to the resilience. I think both Tipneri and Barbara Ryans asked about resilience. Is that, do you find any challenge in building resilience with the community and how you manage them, and also how you measure resilience? So that's
good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's quite a big question, but I will try to answer it. Yes, resilience, as I said, can be built, because we are talking about a community that can, first of all, it begins with a change, a shift in our thinking. We need to go and understand what is really happening in the community. We need to change the banner from where we are entering, because sometimes as outsiders in a community, we only have one window of entry, and that's what we want to do, because that's what we want to come back and report upon. But the community has other interests. It's, how do I feed my child? How do I send my child to school? How do I go and find health? Where do I buy my livestock from? So there are issues. So engagement with the community where they are is most important. And then working with community and mobilizing them, talking about do a vulnerability assessment. Why is the community vulnerable? Why is it that they are sending their children away to with traffickers? Why are men just going away, in an unsafe way, migrating, not knowing where they are going? And then work on their coping mechanism. Once you've done the assessment, work with their coping mechanism when there are changes. Because I said, sometimes the stresses and shocks which they are not prepared to handle, like climate change, drought, sudden onset disasters, those are some of the things that will take away. So build community resilience, awareness, education, livelihood, care for their own creation that they live in, and work on their self-governance. So those are some of the key elements. And it can be measured. It can be measured. Resilience can be measured. For instance, I'll give you 2 or 3 very top-level examples. How is the community participating? And are they just recipients of benefits, or are they influencers? That's going to be your first measure. What are the social connections? Usually communities in the source areas are so poor or so marginalized that they don't really have social connections. But are their social connections increasing beyond the community as well? What are their personal relationships? Is there better relationship in the community? Is there an increase in trust? Are people able to say, yes, I'm going out to the village, can I leave my 2 children behind with the neighbor? They know that the neighbor, it's like a neighborhood watch.
Yeah.
Then confidence, their own faith increases. Their emotional and mental health increases. Their physical health increases. And there are other things like material assets will increase. The resources become shared. So if I have food and my neighbor doesn't have, then I'm only quite happy to share with my neighbor. And of course, the capabilities of the community can be measured increasing. So these are some very simple ways that one can measure resilience.
Thanks a lot, Prince. I think this has been really fruitful, and you share your thought and wisdom on how we can do prevention work better. So I think as the time is up, so just like to give you for last few words for the audience to take away from these sessions.
Sorry, can you come again?
Do you have a last few words for the audience to take away from this session as we're wrapping up? Yes.
Yes, thank you for joining in. And I am inviting you to join into a movement of resilience building, which is the best one for prevention of trafficking, because we can work at the other end, and there are some wonderful people who are doing great work. But resilience building is low cost. So you're actually joining into a movement of building resilient communities which are self-sustaining. And this investment is an investment which is for life and for generations to go on.
Thank you, Prince Davis. That's excellent. So the audience, if you'd like to continue discussions, you can connect with Prince via the VUVA app, and there also other materials available online that you can visit the website of Prince and Cheer Fund. So thanks a lot, Prince, for sharing with us and for joining and speaking at the ARA 2020. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.